So a little bit about Science on Tap. For those who don't know, Science on Tap is an opportunity to take science out of the laboratory, or in tonight's case, out of the dig site in Idaho, and bring it into your living room. So this is where some of the most interesting Oregon State researchers and scholars from both Corvallis and Bend campus and from around the state share their fascinating and important work with us. In fact, OSU's leadership in conducting practical, problem-solving research that improves lives, protects natural resources, and drives economic growth was proven again recently. The university attracted $439.7 million in competitive research funds this past fiscal year. That's an increase of 15% over the previous year. We are incredibly proud of our own researchers, including tonight's speaker, Dr. Loren Davis. But there it is. But just so you're aware, Science on Tap is one of just many ways that you can stay connected to OSU and your Alumni Association. Given the unprecedented challenges of the last month, we've worked feverishly to launch a new digital engagement hub called the Beaver Lodge. Trust me, you're gonna want to write down the URL shown on screen here, osualum.com/beaverlodge. This is your one-stop shop to find out about other virtual events, like our upcoming speaker with OSU alumna, former basketball player, Eric Knox, speaking on May 13th about valuing diversity in teams. Or for student support initiatives like You Are Strong, where you can submit video messages of encouragement to students currently facing the life-altering world of COVID-19. Or perhaps you, like Loren, are associated with the College of Liberal Arts and want to find out more about their upcoming series, Connecting the Curious, a lifelong learning program featuring faculty-led discussion forums, seminars, and online book clubs. All of this and more can be found at osualum.com/beaverlodge. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Loren Davis is a researcher at OSU, and we are so proud of and honored to work with him. He is an anthropologist holding both his bachelor's and master's degrees in anthropology from Oregon State University, as well as a PhD in anthropology from the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. Dr. Davis currently leads a research group focused on the discovery and study of archaeological sites from Western North America that date before 12,000 years ago. His work has led him to important discoveries in the Cooper's Ferry site in Western Idaho and on Cedros Island along Mexico's Pacific coast. His work aims to learn more about the earliest evidence of deep sea fishing in the Americas and what this might tell us about migration to the New World. Please welcome OSU's own Dr. Loren Davis.
Hello there, I'm Loren Davis. Let's see, Callie, I need to share my screen.
I just stopped. You should be good to share.
Okay. Let's see, can you see my PowerPoint at this point?
Not yet.
Screen sharing. So what button am I? Oh, there it is, right down there. It's not so hard to find. Okay, here we go. All right. So can you see it now?
Now we can see it.
Okay. Thank you for your patience, everybody. Again, I'm Loren Davis. I'm a professor of anthropology here at Oregon State University. And today we're going to talk about some of the work that I do with others, including OSU students. We take them to different parts in Western North America and make a lot of really great discoveries together. And this work is focused on trying to understand a lot of things about the earliest peoples to come into North America in particular. And this is sort of an adventure that takes us to lots of places. And I'm happy to share some of this stuff with you today. So we're going to begin by talking about one place in particular, Cooper's Ferry. This is an archaeological site in western Idaho. As you can see here on the map, where Oregon, Idaho, Washington come together, and you can see where Oregon State University is located. And later on in the talk, we're going to go to Cedros Island, which is in northwestern Mexico in the state of Baja California in Mexico. So here's an overview of the place that we work in western Idaho. As you can see, it's pretty dry. And not a lot of trees, for example, down there. It's a pretty hot place to work in the summer. This is the lower Salmon River Canyon, and I work here in collaboration with the Bureau of Land Management. In fact, we excavate this site, the Cooper's Ferry site. It's on federal land that's managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and they've been our great partners over the years. And we also have worked in cooperation with the Nez Perce Indian tribe. Working here at this site, we began working here actually in 1997, but we began a long-term project starting in 2009, doing some excavations here at the site. And here's an image of a Google Earth photograph that shows our excavation units. So we have two spots, one's called Area A and Area B. And we're gonna mostly talk about Area A today, but from 2009 to 2018, we excavated here, and I ran a whole series of different archaeological field schools here at the site. And here's just some overview of what it looks like in Area B. As you can see, it's a pretty large excavation. The upper part we removed with machinery because it's a lot of rocky material that had been laid in there to protect the archaeological site. And we got below that, and it got into very fine, soft materials that required us to move very slowly and carefully through there. And then Area A, which is the place that we worked at toward the end of the 10 years, and it's revealed some of the oldest information that we'll talk about. This area too is kind of deep, and but most of what you see right here was actually excavated by hand. And I don't mean like using a lot of heavy duty shovels and stuff so much as we actually scrape this material away with hand trowels and dustpans. So it takes a very long time for us to get down toward the bottom of the site. As I mentioned, we run archaeology field schools here in Idaho, and here's just a shot of the 2018 field school, and we attract students from all over the US that will come work with us for sometimes 6, 7, 8 weeks in the field. And as they do this work, they learn how to do archaeology, and they actually do it in the pursuit of research problems that we are sort of addressing together. And the effort that these students put together, I can't sort of tell you enough how important this really is, because we couldn't do this work without this kind of help. So hats off to the OSU archaeology students that have helped us actually achieve some of the great things we'll talk about today. So this is a photograph of the north wall of Area A. And what you're looking at here is what we call a profile. So this profile is just simply a cleaned up series of walls here. And toward the top, you see the word fill. And that is basically road construction material that was pushed onto the surface of the site in the early part of the 20th century. And then you see some letters that says LU8 and goes all the way down to LU6, LU5, 4, and so on. So those are different layers that we have encountered as we excavated. And you can see there's some different colors and some slightly strange little patterns, but the colors are significant because they show us sort of differences in what we call deposition. That is, sediments get sort of laid down and it buries the site through time. In this sort of instance, like a layer cake. And from the very bottom of the site, we have sort of a gravelly deposit. And then there's a gray sand, that's layer 2. But the part that's really critical to understanding the early occupation here at the site is in the third layer, or as we call it, lithostratigraphic unit 3. And we'll talk mostly about this layer. And this is essentially a wind-blown glacial dust, or it's also known as a loess, is another word for that. And this accumulates very slowly, building up through time on the flanks of the canyon. And as people come to the site through time, they do different activities, they leave behind artifacts, and these get buried. And that's how the archaeological record is constructed. And as we're looking at this profile, you can think of this also as sort of like a history of the oldest stuff is at the bottom and the youngest events are at the very top, and everything gets buried sort of through time. And as I mentioned before, we excavate very slowly. You can see some of the tools on the right where we've encountered a pit, and it actually, you can see slightly that there's a different colored sediment around the rocks, and the rocks are actually inside a cylindrical void that was excavated into the ground, sort of almost like the size of a trash can. And they put rocks and other things inside it. And these rocks actually show evidence of having had other flakes removed from them, so they are artifacts. That is, they show modification by people. The trowels that you see here in the image are the most common digging tool that we use. And we do this because we want to find as many objects as we can in place. That is, we want to uncover them in the ground and then we measure their position. And it allows us to sort of like forensic scientists to reconstruct the events of what happened in what order and what items go with each other. And most importantly, what objects, organic objects that is, can be used for getting radiocarbon ages, and we can measure time this way. Okay, so this diagram shows a stratigraphic profile, but in a drawing format. So here you see these brown layers, and that's the sediment of lithostratigraphic unit 3 or layer 3. On the right-hand side, you see sort of a dark black sort of shape, and has some red dots, and there's numbers also. And what's important here, I want to draw your attention to it, is on the right-hand side, we found the remnants of a fire pit. So basically, someone made a fire here at the site, and they, like a campfire, and in the process of doing that, they burned charcoal that returned a series of radiocarbon ages between 14,400 to 15,000 years ago. And we also found some burned pieces of bone. We also found some small flakes from the probably resharpening of stone tools in this fire pit, ash and burned ground. So that's significant. That marks the presence of people at the site at this time. And that's not even necessarily the oldest record, or oldest evidence of people here, but that's a very significant marker. Over here on the left-hand side, you see there's sort of a gray, it looks like almost like an upside down hat in the ground. That's another strange pit that was dug in the ground. And in that pit, we found a fragment of a tooth from the species of Equus. And most of you probably can guess already what that animal is. But this fragment that has the red arrow pointing to it, or from it, is actually from this part of a horse's mouth. And this is a molar off the edge of a horse's mouth. And this, this tooth ends up being, over 14,000 years old. And we didn't date the tooth directly, but we can date it by its position relative to other things. So this is probably what these horses look like. And these are Mongolian wild horses here in the image. And they're probably the closest representation of the horse species that were present in Idaho at the time. The horses went extinct in North America at the end of the last glacial period. And so at about between 12 and 13,000 years ago, so these horses all disappear. So in this kind of case, the Cooper's Ferry, we think that we have evidence here of horses, at least one horse, probably being hunted, butchered, and maybe even eaten, of course, here at the site. And all these things may be going together. We found other pieces of bone around the same living surfaces that we were looking at here in the profile before. And these are larger pieces of bone that we think are probably from a horse as well. So this is the same diagram I showed you before, but with more information on it. In fact, this shows the presence of all the artifacts that we found in place. That is, we excavated them and could measure them in place. Then it also shows the presence of a series of other pits that we had found. So, for example, on the left-hand side, you see it says PFA2, that's pit feature A2. And we found that one actually in 1997. And then later on in 2018, we found feature 134. That's the next pit to the right. And 135, we found that one as well, and some others. But pit feature A2 is very special because as we excavated this, we very carefully went down and tried to map everything we could inside the pit. And you can see there's a whole cluster of objects that are in the pit. But most notably, we found some really cool objects inside this pit feature. So we found a series of tools, including 4 spear points at the top. In the middle, you have a series of tools that are maybe are going to be made into things like these spear points at the top. There's cutting tools, scraping tools, pounding tools, and so on. So essentially, we found the contents of somebody's toolbox. You might think of it this way. And they put all these tools in the ground and they buried it and they walked away and they didn't use it again until we found it 13,000 years later. So that's pretty amazing to be able to find things like this. But that speaks to sort of the special nature of the Cooper's Ferry site. People kept coming back to the site over and over and over again and doing a lot of different activities here at the site. We also found within layer 3, we found a series of what we call formed tools. So from the left-hand side, A shows us a couple views of the base of what we think is a spear point. And B is also the same thing. C is probably the blade portion of a spear point. And the rest of these items are cutting and scraping kinds of tools. So as people were coming to the site, they may have brought with them broken artifacts, broken tools, and they would take them apart and maybe make new ones and refashion their weapons, and they would discard items that they didn't have any more use, for which they had no more use, and then they would move on. And in leaving these things behind, we can actually find the evidence of the things that they were doing. So what Cooper's Ferry tells us is that essentially people were at this place in western Idaho, what's now western Idaho, about 16,000 years ago. So the radiocarbon dating that we have from the site in association with objects, artifacts, and other organic things that were buried at the site show that people were there a little bit before 16,000 years ago. Now, why this number is significant is because it means that the traditional model of thinking about how people got into the Americas is that they may have come down from Alaska, Yukon, through Alberta, exiting into Montana and the Dakotas through a thing called the Icefree corridor. It was a gap between a piece of ice, or actually 2 pieces of ice, that were the size of Canada. And this ice-free corridor, though, it turns out, was essentially closed until about 14,800. And then after that, it may have begun to open, but may not have been ecologically viable and not a really great place to live until later. Well, Cooper's Ferry shows us that people are south of the ice before this ice-free corridor even gets started opening. So that's kind of a pretty major thing to be able to say. And what we think it means is that people were very likely then coming down the Pacific coast. And as they did this, the first left-hand turn away from the Pacific coast is the Columbia River. And so you take the first off-ramp, so to speak, from a coastal route, and you can make your way up the Columbia River Basin. And eventually, if you keep on going, you will get to the Salmon River. And so Cooper's Ferry may show us, and I don't want to say it's the earliest evidence, we haven't found the first, I should say. It is very early evidence, but we very likely can find earlier sites in other places if we just can get lucky, perhaps, or even know where to look. So, but this is kind of interesting for us to be able to say now with a lot of certainty that the coast is very likely the way. Now, where did they come from if they're coming down the coast? Where is this place that they're originating from? And that's a bigger question for us to try to address. From the point of view of genetics, what we know is that scientists that study the genetic signature, genetic record of human skeletons tell us that essentially the peoples of the Americas, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, have ancestry in Northeast Asia. And they very likely, through a series of groups coming together, by 23,000 years or so, they're separating themselves away from other parts of Asia, and they're beginning to move into the Americas, where they will become genetically distant. That is, they'll become sort of separated genetically from Northeast Asia in time. And so that is not really a big question of where people came from. But what we don't know is sort of within this whole giant realm of Northeast Asia, where is this sort of happening? And also, more importantly, culturally, where is this happening? Where are people getting their ideas, their concepts, their traditions, and so on? And your skeletal genetic history is one thing. How you know how to interact with the world is another. So we can ask the question, where is the cultural progenitor Progenitor is just another word for asking what is the ancestral source of something? So we can say, what is the ancestral source of all these sort of artifacts that we see reflected at the Cooper's Ferry site and in other early sites in the Americas? And what's important to think about here is that cultural materials like artifacts, scraping tools, cutting tools, weapons for hunting, these provide us with clues that we can use to sort of look for very similar matches or patterns someplace else. And why this is really critical is because stone tools signal patterns of thought. That is, to go from a block of rock down to making it into something like a spear point requires you to have knowledge and skill and apply it in the right sequence to actually take that rock apart in the right way and end up with a very specific end product. It's not like you can just throw the rock against the wall and a spear point pops out of it. You have to do hundreds of correct moves with the right kind of ability to make that thing come out in the same form. So think of it also a bit like a computer code, it's sort of a sequence of operations that has to happen. And this is also, we can think of it as this idea of traditional technological knowledge. That is the ability to how to do things, how to make things, and how to craft items. And traditional technological knowledge is maintained. That is, it's very, very useful. We need it to survive. And it's transmitted by telling and teaching others. And so we can look at how these patterns of ideas that are reflected in the shape and form of artifacts, how are they distributed across space, that is across something like from Northeast Asia into the Americas, and how do they go through time? So archaeology on a lot of levels is sort of a pattern matching exercise, you might say. And so we're sort of looking very curiously at patterns. So here's an example of the artifacts that we found at Cooper's Ferry, the photographs, next to some drawings of other artifacts that are from Hokkaido, Japan. So they're in northern island of Japan. And we think that these things are very, very similar. And they're similar not only in their two-dimensional and three-dimensional form, but also in the way that they're created. That is the way you went from a block of rock to the final product. And what's more interesting too is that the drawing objects here are older than the objects we find at Cooper's Ferry. So if you want to make an argument about where people may have been getting their ideas from, what part of the world, before they made the journey to the Americas, my money right now is on the area around northern Japan and in that part of the northwestern Pacific Rim is very likely where people of sharing these ideas may have come from. So this is just a map that shows us sort of the difference, these different places I was just mentioning. So the Kamoshiritaki site, where those drawings of Japanese artifacts came from, this is in the island of Hokkaido. And here we see the Cooper's Ferry site. If we think about, well, gee, that's a really long way away. How could you have gotten there? Well, the red line shows more of a traditional migration route where people may have walked essentially from Siberia through what's called Beringia, the area between far eastern Russia and Alaska. And during the last ice age, to make ice the size of Canada, you would have drawn the oceans down and you would have created a bridge between Russia and Alaska. So people could have made this very long walk, and it's about 10,000 kilometers to do that walk. If you just simply follow along the edge of the northwestern Pacific Rim, across the northern Pacific Rim, and then finally paddling down the northwest coast of the Americas to the mouth of the Columbia, it's 12,600 kilometers, which is longer, but what's important to remember here is that, well, you're in boats very likely, at least part of the time, so you can pull people and materials along with you or push them along with you as you go. And I don't think these two migration routes are that dissimilar in the sense of even one's longer than another, but you have advantages and disadvantages for either one. So I think it's quite realistic to assume this could be possible. But the question that remains, though, is what does the archaeological record look like for a very early orientation to the ocean? And we can ask the question of, did the first Americans have maritime skills? And maritime skills are essentially these adaptations to the ocean that extend beyond the tidal zone and beyond the near shore. That is, did they have sort of full mastery of the ocean from a traditional point of view? And we assume that they probably also wouldn't let go of their traditional orientation to the land. It's that they could have used the full swath of the deep parts of the ocean and also on the land. So, but measuring this is something else. You know, you can speculate that people could have used the ocean, but being able to measure it is something else. And this has been very difficult because, as I mentioned before, ice the size of Canada, when you have big pieces of ice on the planet during ice ages, when those melt and take us to the period that we're in now, this interglacial period, the sea level comes back up. All that water returns to the ocean, submerges all these sites on the edges of the continents, and makes it very difficult for us to actually measure these kinds of questions, because those kinds of coastal sites are probably out there submerged. But there are some places along Western North America where you can actually find evidence of very early coastal orientations, and I'll talk about that next. So we're going to go to Cedros Island, and our interest in working on Cedros Island is to also address this issue of, did people have very early orientations to the ocean? And Cedros Island is special because it is literally a desert island. I work there with my two co-investigators. I have a National Science Foundation grant right now, and Dr. Matthew Delorier works with me, and also Antonio Porcayo works with us. He is an archaeologist that works for the Mexican Archaeological Survey, or INA is another way to think about it. And as you can see these images, it's a very dry place. This is a desert island, and water is in short supply. And what we found is that in the past, there were areas where we think springs were active, freshwater springs, and people would have had to make hard decisions, like, do I bring the water to the food, or do I bring the food to the water? And in this case, it turns out that, well, 8 pounds of water might last you a day. 8 pounds is a gallon of water. 8 pounds of food might last you many days. So the better solution is to bring the food to the water. You can just sit around a spring and eat all your seafood. And we found a series of archaeological sites that are up away from the shoreline that are quite early, that are near these ancient springs. So I'm going to talk about some of the things we found from there. So this is a site that translates to the Rocky Hill site, the Cerro Pedregoso site. And as you can see, it's a very dry environment. There's not a lot of vegetation that's obscuring things as we work there. And as we did survey and walked around here, we could find lots of artifacts on the surface, and there's a lot of marine shells also on the surface. And this is an excavation unit that we put in last summer as we worked there. And as we began to excavate through these sediments, we immediately made discoveries. In fact, as we would work, people would make these really great discoveries and, you know, holler, and people would come over and take a look at it and take pictures. But one of the more amazing things that we were finding as we were excavating were these objects. And this is OSU anthropology student Kirsten Paulson. She was an undergraduate. She's going to start to work with us in the graduate program here soon. But Kirsten is holding a very special item, and that's this. This is made from abalone shell, and this is a hook. So it's a fragment of a hook, at least. The tip is gone, but the shank portion where you would tie on a line is still present. And as we excavated, we found many of these. Actually, here's another one. All told, we found, I think the number was something like 36 in total that we found throughout the summer and with past years. So what's important about this is we found many, many examples of these. That gives us an idea of sort of the technology as it's structured. But we also found some other tools that help us sort of fill in the blanks of what people were doing with these large hooks. This is a rock that we found. Here it is in place as the excavators found it. And you can see there's a groove cut around the midsection. That's pretty unusual. It's not natural. We don't find rocks like that on the island, but lots of round rocks, but not ones with grooves around the whole sort of equator in a sense. We also, as we excavated, we found evidence of people living at the site and doing sort of camp-related activities. This is the remnants of a campfire that someone made, and we found a series of these as we excavated through the site. So you can have a stacked series of repeated occupations at the site that show us people coming back over and over and over again and living here, and fortunately throwing things away so we can find them and we can help to understand what they're doing through time. And these hearths and other things that we dated were between about 10,000 to 12,000 years old. So here's a whole series of some of the nicest things that we found, but the top row shows a series of shell hooks. They're made on abalone shell, and they're also made on mussel shell. And I've put, if you can see the numbers, 10/0, for example, that's a 10 gauge equivalent hook. And for those of you that are fisher people in the audience, you will appreciate what that means. 10 gauge hooks are used for very large fishes. And 5 centimeter, the scale, 5 centimeters is about 2 inches long. So those are pretty large objects. And they go all the way down to very small ones. And we found there's that rock that has the groove through it. We found another one that was broken at sort of the groove, but we could put it back together, the red one. Lower left, we find a series of these kinds of tools that they sort of look like turtle shells almost in 3 dimensions, but they're made of rock, and they're essentially scraping kinds of tools that have a very special use I'll mention. We also found these 2 pieces of rock rings that someone must have taken a very long time to make, because to make that out of a piece of basalt, for example, could be a very long process to shape it just right. Okay, so what are these things for? Well, the hooks we would assume are probably for catching fishes, but how would you attach them? Let's say, it's something you could pull the fish in with. Well, there's a plant on the island. It's an agave. There's agave species, I should say, on the island. And inside the agave leaf is a lot of these little fibers. If you've ever eaten an artichoke, you notice that these sort of fibers in there that are really not easy to chew, and you probably shouldn't chew them, but you end up spitting them out a lot. Well, those fibers are very similar to this kind of plant, and you can process the fibers out of them, and you can actually make cordage. And that cordage can be then combined to make larger ropes. So on the right hand and the bottom here, this is sisal rope, which is an organic rope that's very, very strong. So this is the process of how you do it. You take the threads and you essentially put them sort of against your leg, and you wind it by rubbing your hand on it to sort of wind them up. And they have little hooks, fibery hooks, and they grab each other and they stay together as you wind it in this case. Well, these ring pieces, we think, are probably part of a process of making even stronger, higher gauge rope. And we think they're part of what's called a spindle whorl. And spindle whorls are used throughout Mexico and other places in the world. And essentially, you put them on a stick and you spin the stick, and the centrifugal force actually grabs the fibers and allows you to sort of spin them together. And you can combine multiple lines of fiber to make higher strength ropes. So 2-strand rope made of agave is 300 foot-pounds of strength. 3 strands is 865 pounds of pull strength. So it's really quite strong. So we think that's probably what those rings are for. We don't think that they're making these rings probably many, many hours to create them, only to put them on the end of a rope like a weight. We think that they're probably used to give that stick its centrifugal force to spin really quite well. We also have found some pieces of bone at the site that tell us about, very likely, the foods that people were eating. And this is a piece of fish bone, actually. And it's a pretty large piece, and it comes from a fish that has a mouth that can open up and create a vacuum. So basically, it's a slurping fish. And this is from, we think, a Pacific black sea bass. It's a very large animal that lives around the island, and also you find them in Southern California and beyond to the south. And black sea bass are enormous. They're really, really big fishes, and we find their bones in the sites. In fact, just to give you an idea how large they are, here's one that was caught in Southern California in the 20th century. And today they're protected there, but they're still around in Baja California. And we find the vertebrae and other bones of a lot of other fishes, including, in addition to black sea bass, we find barracuda and yellowtail and halibut. And in the very bottom, in the middle, you see that's a vertebrae of a fish. And there's, you can see my 3 fingers behind it. And that shows you the diameter of these fishes. And some of these fishes are bigger than people. So you must have needed a pretty serious technology to actually pull these things out of the water. So we think that it could have looked something like this. So if you take the hooks and put bait on them, the little gray patch on the end is the bait. And you could put multiple ones on a line that made of agave, tie it to a weight, sink the weight down to the bottom, and then you just hang tight, because a really big fish is probably going to come and bite on it, and then you're going to have to really, really fight. In fact, as I began to think about this whole process and looking at the evidence that we had, I couldn't help but think about sort of this kind of scenario, the old man and the sea kind of story like Hemingway talks about. And essentially, we're looking at people using hand lines to pull in fishes, often probably bigger than they were, from boats, because you cannot catch these kinds of fishes from the shore. You have to actually go offshore and do this. And they were successfully hauling them in, hand over hand, maybe after tiring them out over hours. And they brought them up to the springs and ate them. So for us, this is pretty strong evidence that people are using this really rich traditional technological knowledge, in this case, making organic hooks out of the materials they had, shells, making line out of the plants that were available, and using rocks to other things to basically make the entire fishing kit system. And they would apply it then out in places where they knew in their minds they could visualize offshore there's a three-dimensional structure in the ocean, and that certain fishes live at certain depths. And that's probably what those different size hooks are for. They're going to go out and catch different kinds of fishes because they know that they actually live in a certain spot. So for us, this is really, really great evidence for people showing mastery of the ocean, these really rich maritime skills. So far, we've been able to push the age of some of this stuff to about 13,000 years. And we're looking for earlier evidence on the island. We would love to see evidence of people doing these same activities on the island in the realm of 16,000 years and earlier. That would really, really be amazing. So we just need to keep searching. And as we do that, it lends a lot more weight to the idea that not only were the people very likely come down the coast, but they did this armed with a whole series of skills, knowledge, and abilities that allowed them to have this full mastery of the ocean. So what does this sort of all mean in the biggest picture of all? Well, we have these traditional models on the left. It was, sort of competing ideas that people could have either walked from Asia through the interior part of North America and spread everywhere else, or they maybe came down the coast. Until recently, the interior model had been sort of the dominant sort of explanation that a lot of people had embraced. But with the discovery of sites like Cooper's Ferry, and there's some other sites in Texas that show that people were definitely south of the ice before this ice-free corridor was open, that has really caused us to have to change our ideas. Those discoveries have really changed everything. So now we can say more definitively that it's not likely interior, it's very likely coastal. And so that makes where we live in the Pacific Northwest a special place, because the evidence to actually address these issues can be found also in Oregon. So we can try to find archaeological sites. We can try to look offshore. We can look onshore, above sea level today, to try to find evidence of this. Now that we know it's possible, all it really takes for us to find is the target, the dirt of the right age. Where can we find archaeological sites in the right layers, now that we know that it's very possible that they exist? So there's a lot of different groups and individuals to thank for the work that I've talked about here. Again, the Bureau of Land Management has been a very, very big supporter of our work in Idaho, and I want to thank them a lot. It just goes to show that there are really great treasures on our public lands, and they don't have to be, big and impressive monuments. Sometimes it's the things that are held in the ground that are really important. The Nez Perce Tribe, too, has been a great partner for us, and we have granting agencies to thank as well. And I want to also thank INA, that is the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico, for their great partnership. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Loren. What a fascinating presentation. I think my favorite part was the fish with the vacuum mouths.
Yeah.
We did get a couple questions from the audience. So Janet was wondering whether there was a layer of ash found in the layers of the north wall from the Mount Mazama eruption.
Well, Janet, we did not find a layer of ash in the north wall. And that is only because the layers that we were excavating through were too old. That is, they were older than the eruption of the Mazama eruption, which, if you don't know, Mazama eruption is the eruption of Crater Lake. And so this happens close to 7,000 years ago, but all the layers that we work in are older than 7,000 years. And the reason for that is because in the 1930s, road construction cut away part of the site that probably contained that ash.
Okay, great. Next, Melinda was wondering what the most satisfying discovery from one of your digs has been so far.
Well, that's a good question. We get asked that one a lot, and my answer keeps changing all the time, I guess. For me, it's sort of the discovery of these things that we call features. That is, they're three-dimensional arrangements of things, or they're things that you can't pick up and move away, like a pit, for example. Excavating a pit and finding unusual contents inside. I mean, we didn't have any time to get into it here, but in area B, that is the other part of the site that we haven't talked about so much, there are 5 different pits over there that have 5 different wolverine skull fragments in them. So that is, the jaw bones of wolverines are in these 5 different pits, and they also buried spear points and other things with them. So there's something very unusual happening over there, and to me that was very, very interesting and compelling. Also too, I think finding these shell hooks, that has been just amazing. In fact, the discoveries we've made on Cedros Island show us the earliest evidence of deep sea fishing in the Americas comes from that site I showed you. So, and by far, it's a really, really special site in Mexico.
Very interesting. Did your team come up with any theories of what the wolf skulls could mean?
Well, there weren't wolves, they're wolverines.
Oh, wolverines.
Yeah, so wolverines, you know, I mean, we're working on coming up with some explanations perhaps, but wolverine in a lot of traditional societies has sort of a special place, special individual, and it could be that this is being put in the ground as sort of a, you know, a tribute to the animal, perhaps after it was killed, or I don't know. And that's the part of archaeology that's sort of the speculative, interpretive side, but yeah, that's something we're going to work on trying to figure out.
Very interesting. And the next question comes from Lawrence. He was wondering whether there's any evidence of humans migrating back and forth between Asia and North America.
Yeah, I think there is actually, especially later in time after the Ice Age. You have groups that will move back and forth in the high Arctic, for example, from each other. I'm not really sure how early that kind of goes. It seems like a lot of it seems to be, as far as we can tell, one way, at least initially, but I would have a hard time imagining it didn't go back and forth. It's just a question of how to measure it.
Okay, great. We will do a couple more since we have some more time, and a whole bunch just popped in. So let's see, Leslie is interested to know how the Idaho site relates to the Missoula Flood.
Okay, so the Missoula floods, in the diagram that I showed, the map, I had some parts of the Columbia River Basin that sort of look like a big lake. And that's because ice came down and dammed the Clark Fork River that flows through Missoula, Montana. And it created a very large lake in the area of what now is the town of Missoula. In fact, if you go there and you look up on the hills, there's the big M for Missoula up on the hill. And there's all these horizontal lines that look like sort of bathtub rings almost. And those are actually old positions of this massive lake that cut into the edge of the mountainside. And this flood would have burst out of through its ice dam, under its ice dam, and emptied tremendous amounts of water through the Columbia River Basin, through Idaho, Washington, in parts of Oregon. In fact, it would have come up and flooded OSU's campus. So it was a really, really big flood. The thing about the flood, though, is that Cooper's Ferry is above it in elevation. So that is, we don't see any effects of the flood because of the elevation of the site. But there are deposits of mega flood influence, that is, these big sediments that were brought into the canyon, but in lower parts of the canyon. So if you go downstream a day's raft float or so away, you can find some of that sediment. So we think this is why Cooper's Ferry is an unusual discovery too, because as you get lower into the Columbia River Basin, these megafloods would have stripped away any evidence of early occupation that could be in this 16, 15, 14,000 year period. So that's a bit of a shame, perhaps, but that just also helps us figure out that, well, we need to work outside that zone of destruction.
Okay, great. And we have some archaeologist newbies who are wondering, what advice would you give to someone who is new to the world of archaeology within the context of all of the terms and information required in order to make sense of a site?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the whole terms and concepts, like if you get into any technical field, any scientific field, then you sort of have to learn another language in a sense. You got to learn all the different terms and concepts. And I think that one of the things, if I could go back in time and tell my younger self, and I would say, just become really, really good at reading and writing. And I know that sounds silly, but a lot of the skill sets that allow you to go really far in archaeology involve being a good thinker, being a good logical thinker, and then coming up with ideas that are worth pursuing, and then being able to communicate them. And if you can't write and speak and do good communication. You can't speak well to people, then you have difficulties, let's say. I think also too, when this time that we're in right now, where we all have to sort of hang out around the house, and it's a good time for you to practice your learning in terms of reading and writing, of course, but this time will pass and we'll all get to go out and do everything we want to do. And I also recommend that students need to do a lot of outdoor stuff. That is, they need to get a lot of field experience. So again, archaeology is a pattern matching exercise. The more things you see, the more experiences you've had in the field, the better. And it'll help you also become more confident and be able to interact with people in the field.
Great advice. I think we could all work on our communication and could all do some more time outside. So that's perfect. How about this one? How did the dates from Cedros Island compare with other ancient fishing sites along the Pacific coast, as far south as Peru and Chile?
So if we move let's see, if you go into Peru, for example, that's where you get sort of the next oldest set of shell hooks. But those hooks are in the age range between, let's say, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 years or so. And, the majority of them, and they look quite similar, but they're just not really quite as old. And as we move farther north into Southern California, there's evidence that people are on islands, for example, off of Santa Barbara, and they're doing fishing activities, but they're just not using the same technology. And we're not exactly sure why that is. It could be that they're leaving these fishing tools out there and they're submerged by the ocean, perhaps. I don't know. Another connection with Japan that's interesting is the oldest fish hooks in the world come from Okinawa in southern Japan, and they look incredibly similar to the ones from Cedros Island, but they're separated in time by a lot of years. So the ones in Japan, are something close to about 10,000 years older than the ones we find in Mexico. So that doesn't mean that the ideas didn't persist. Making shell hooks that allow you to pull a fish from the ocean, I mean, that's a useful skill. Why would you ever give that up? So I wouldn't be surprised if we see there's this continuity and people share these ideas all over.
Good point. Well, I think that we'll wrap up on that note. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for speaking with us tonight. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We really appreciate you being here today. We'll send you a follow-up email with some links to YouTube videos if you're interested in seeing more of what Dr. Davis does in the Cooper's Ferry site, and also links to the Beaver Lodge that we mentioned at the beginning of the evening. So thank you all for coming. Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody.